Hi, and welcome to Academic Compliance Academy. In this video, I'm going to try to define dynamic compliance. Before we can define a new way of doing compliance on a risk-based approach, let's have a look back at the old school compliance approach. So, compliance, the reactive compliance, old school compliance, was based on three factors. So there had to be an actor. It could be a company, member state, any individual. And this actor would try to seek to conform his or her or its actions to some external requirements. And that is the second part. It's the norms or the regulations that this actor had to comply with. So the second part is actually really important in this sense, because the reactive compliance approach, the old school compliance, in that area and that approach, the norms and the regulations are externally given. There's no internal requirements. It is purely considered as external requirements, and then you have to try to get the actor to conform to this norm or regulation in some way, and that is the third element, that you need to have some kind of influence by incentives. Well, we all know the legal disciplines incentive. That could be like tax reductions or even punishment. You both have carrot and you have stick. So the simple definition of compliance is based on the reactive, the old school compliance, and it just says you need an actor who needs to conform to norms externally given, and we need some incentives. So if we take that, let's go into the new definition of dynamic compliance. So this is a more advanced definition because it requires a bit more attention. So an actor is not just an individual or one organization, but we have to look at an organization as a complex environment, a complex organized with a lot of contracts, a lot of relationships. So it's not that simple anymore. Because one department in a company might conform perfectly with some parts of the regulation where others have deficiency in the same area. Why we have to acknowledge that an actor can actually be a very complex organization, an entity, or other. So it's not that simple. It's the same if you see that the actor is a member state. There will be a lot of different mechanisms that we need to approach. Also, to the second part, the norms of the regulations can be external, but can as well be internal. A great example of this internal kind of normal regulation that we put out is, okay, let's have a company. This company in its strategy has put out one of the big fails of compliance, which would be saying we have a non-tolerance against corruption. That is a rule, a regulation, a norm that they had set themselves. It's internally given to their own company. It's their operational system. So their strategy has set some limitations, because especially if you do a no tolerance. So what happens is, if we have a sub-department somewhere in the world where there might be a high corruption rate, the scandal is almost just there to happen, because we need to apply in the dynamic compliance, we need to apply and assess our internal given requirements, but also limitations. Which is so important, because most of the scandals that we actually see out in the world typically origins from the firm, the country, the politicians themselves, because they typically go out with a really hard statement saying, okay, we have a zero tolerance, no tolerance against this, and try to like enforce something, and then you see like behind the curtains, well, someone might have a really green agenda, but flying every week all over the world, doing a lot of pollution, and that just doesn't comply with each other. So we need, in the dynamic compliance, we need to address both external but also internally created limitations, regulations, and norms. So of course the behavior of the actor is influenced by incentive, but the incentives might also origin from internal alignment with the core values. So let's look at the core values of example given a company. If you have put out a green agenda, you might also incentivize through payment schemes or other types of incentives throughout your channel to secure that your employees align themselves with the core values of the firm. So there's a lot of like, before with the reactive definition, incentives would be typically like tax reductions or the carrot stick, like you would go to prison, there would be an actual fine, a punishment. But because we're opening up for the internal side of compliance, the core values within a firm, also within a member state, well, then we have to look at what are we actually putting out there for our employees? What are the possibilities? Could we establish more efficient ways to align our operative side with the core values? That is dynamic compliance. You have to look all the way around. It's not just externally given. Your own strategy, your own core values have to go through the whole system and even out to your contractual partners. So the actors, their behavior is not limited to the functional character of a single action, but you need to understand how the actor will ensure conformity in any given sense, returning to the norm, society's expectation, regulations, both internally and external. So when you have a company that has some political agenda or has a green strategy that really aligns with society right now, you have to make sure that that goes all the way through your channels, because otherwise there is a scandal coming. Because society, when you put that out in your strategy, society will look at it, your stakeholders will look at it, punish you if you're not compliant all through your business operations. So this is a definition of dynamic compliance, just saying, okay, before it was very externally oriented, now we put in the internal. And I will also say this one more time, we also have the vice versa. So internal and external also, they have areas where the gray area we also have to align with that, because we need to look at what we do internally might affect external and the other way around, which means that compliance have to secure the whole system of external internal. So I've just put out the conformity here, because when we talk about compliance, there's a lot of talking about I'm trying to be conform, and this definition will also be very relevant when we go into the actual legal framework of the EU, because they do not typically use the terminology compliance, they use the terminology of conformity. So I found this amazing French definition, would not bother you with that. So I've translated it into English. I'm just going to read it out loud for a short second. So conformity is a set of actions aimed at making measures such as behavior of managers and staff within public organizations or private and non-profit associations, companies, unions, etc. towards third parties that comply with the external and or internal standard applicable to the place they operate. So internal, very important in this sense. By norm, we refer to the relevant element of law, norms of law, directives, law, and regulations, without forgetting the internal standards, the organization of soft law, which can be assimilated to combined commitments. And then there's a notion in terms of compliance. Conformity is expanded with the inclusion of society and risk. So conformity, this definition of conformity doesn't take in a lot of society, but there's a lot of culture in it that it has the internal standards. And when we go to compliance, we take not only this definition of conformity, but we also take in society and risk assessment. So it's just to try to limit those two words also, so don't think conformity is compliance. Well, conformity is one thing, compliance is looking at it in a broader perspective. So I've tried to define compliance into three, or divide it into three core areas. So I have these three core elements. I'm going to go through them one by one. The first one, which is it has never been in focus in terms of reactive compliance. It's very much the norm and the aim. And this norm and aim, it regards the purpose of a business, but also country, union, or whatsoever. It is the key values and fundamental principles. So typically when we looked at reactive compliance, the old school compliance, you would look at a law, say, okay, there's this specific requirement, but you would never look to the aim of the law. Look at the preamble in the directives and see, oh, so what is this? Why did they make this law? What is the aim? What is the norm behind this law? And then say, okay, so we might comply with this single requirement, but by doing so, are we complying with the norm, the given norm, the aim of the regulation? That we would never have done that in the reactive compliance, but this is what we do in dynamic compliance. We look broader than the specific regulatory requirements. So norms can of course be internal. I've already been briefly around this because it can be a strategy, it can be like your essence. Even persons can have a norm, an aim that we need to stick compliant to, otherwise we might get disturbed or stressed out. There might be external norms too, society's expectations, especially when it comes to social responsibility, etc. So that is a norm aim. It's a more fluent thing, it's not that tangible, but it is so important because this is what we need to secure, also because most of these norms and aims, they are politically entangled in some sense, especially the green agenda. So are you green? Even though you comply with certain regulations, social, like soft law guidelines or anything else, but are you really green as a company? That's a norm, that is the aim, that is what you're proclaiming to the world. The second part is what we know the best from the reactive compliance regime. It's a regulatory part of compliance. But regulation in this sense also we have to, in this context, also regard the internal frame. So this is kind of the whole basic about going from reactive to dynamic compliance. It is including the internal sphere of a company, that regulation, how you do things, how you've done your procedures. That is the internal regulation that you have done for yourself. And it's not something that you can just skip because then you have done no action. When we go into dynamic compliance, because it's a way to approach risk-based society, risk-based regulation, you need to address it actively. So you need to have procedures. You need to know what your business operation is doing. You need to set out the line because it's the only way to control it against your strategy, against your norm, aim, and secure compliance throughout the whole organization, country, etc. So the regulatory part here, we have the internal and then we have the external part, which would be hardcore regulation, legislation from the outside world. It might be national, international, also your contractual agreements. So you have to align it with these external given factors at the same point. But again, the point being that dynamic compliance is assessing the internal the external, and also the overlapping between the two. The last thing we have as one of the core elements of compliance, and especially dynamic compliance, is the technical part, which is, depending on literature, you can have different terminologies. It might be technical, it might be operational, but this is where we have the norm and aim, which is kind of policy based. We have the regulations, that is like processes, policies, external regulation. Then the technical side is the operational part of your business, operational part of your member state. Member states have to comply exactly like any given company. So it works on every level in public or private sector, NGOs whatsoever. Here we have a history of being very much in the tick the box exercise, where we say, oh, have we done this? Yes. Is it solvable or not? Do down the whole line. And it really doesn't work, because when you're in a risk-based society and under the dynamic compliance approach, we need to consider that everything might be fluent. The risk scenario today is not the same as tomorrow. So you have to be much more flexible in your operational approach. And again, we will put in the internal. And the internal, that will be that you need control of your processes. You cannot just leave it up to anyone. And you need to control them in a system that you constantly monitorize and reevaluate if they are fitting to the world around the risks that you are assessing. So that is the operational side. Of course, there are also external limitations, because there might be technological limitations to your wish dream operation. You might sit in the 90s and wanted a system which we could deliver now in the 2020s, but that was not possible. So there's also limitations, but we have to regard these limitations and say, okay, given that, how would we assess, how would we mitigate the risk picture that we are confronting? So, sorry. This slide is just actually, I already put it out. It's just important to know that we have internal, we have external. I divided them into these two purely for explanatory reasons, because the internal factor is really what is new. But what we will top it off with is that internal and external also have to be mixed together in some kind of fluid environment. You need to align the internal to the external, but also the other way around. One of the classic cases that I'll probably put it up many times is bank behavior before the financial crisis in the 2007 to 9. Here you could, as a bank, let's just put this as an example. As a bank, you could say, okay, so people are putting the depth ratio is increasing. But what you have to ask yourself, that is the external environment. Then you have to look at your policy, the internal, and you could try to ratify your own behavior. The problem becomes when the internal ratified behavior, which will say, oh yeah, but our depth ratio might be smaller than the others, so it's fine. Well, if that has an effect on the external, then you're contributing to the problem instead of trying to limit the problem. I know this was also a race for cash. It was a race for profits. Everything was really going fast. But that is why we need to say, okay, there's internal, external, but there's also the environment, or let's say the reflective system between the two, that you might think that you're okay because you can argue your way around your internal policy. But if that affects the external picture, then you need to comply and you need to assess and mitigate, because then you're contributing to the overall risk exposure, which is not what is meant to be, is not aligned with the legal requirement, with society's expectations or anything else. So This element, this slide is just to say that every company would look different. Not everyone has a big norm aim, not everyone has a big regulatory scheme. Of course, in finance, we have a really regulatory, like, big case. But there might be smaller operations, smaller companies just doing day-to-day work. They do not have the same requirements in terms of regulation. So the fitting of this model is it's a good exercise to do in a company, because what you can do is saying, okay, so how is the risk picture? How should we conceive ourselves? Do we have enormous expectations from society? Do we have like a norm and aim? Do we have a goal, very NGO-ish, like we have a goal that exceeds everything, but we might not have a lot of regulatory requirements, and our operational side is really simple because it's purely voluntary basis or something like that. That picture would look totally different than a bank or a pharmaceutical industry operation. So there are some pictures that just designing, trying to evolve this process when going into dynamic compliance and do the self-evaluation here. Because this picture, when you draw it to your entity, member state, whatever, this is also to give you a understanding of how am I going to comply, considering the expectation and how my entity is placed in this society and world. Last but not least, we need to talk about risk. So I've made this standard model, and of course, all around this standard model will be risk factors trying to get in and out and everything. And again, in contrary to the reactive compliance regime, we need to address the internal risk. Here I stated it once again, saying, well, if you are contributing to the risk by your internal behavior, you're contributing to the market risk. And the market risk is frowned upon because of regulation. It's easy to read. Well, then you should mitigate your internal risk so you don't contribute to an increased risk in the market. So we just need to say that, okay, dynamic compliance, it's based on it. The whole idea behind dynamic compliance is that it's an approach, it's a method to control your behavior in a risk-based society to risk-based regulation. It's not every regulation that is risk-based, but where it is risk-based, that is where we can use the dynamic compliance approach. So overall, this is what I try to do. I try to define dynamic compliance, the approach that this whole channel is about. So this is just a definition. There will be tons of more information coming out just to try to expand the knowledge, expand our common understanding of where compliance is now, and that this is a new way to look at compliance. When we do have a risk-based society, we have a risk-based regulation. But all in all, dynamic compliance, because we have internal, external, and risk factors all over, and we need to align everything, it is what I call a game of balance. You need to control those stones on each level all the way down, because otherwise they will not balance. So stay tuned, follow me in this channel, and let's talk more about compliance.